Welcome back, everyone. Mr. Talbot here for you again. We're going to be finishing up topic 1.5, state building in Africa. In our last video, if you recall, we kind of finished up talking about trade development in Africa. So we kind of talked about, gold being exported out of Africa to the Middle East. They're trading for metal tools and goods and stuff from the Middle East, Dar al-Islam, as well as South and East Asia as part of the Indian Ocean Trading Network. Now, one of the other big things that gets sent out of Africa is people. So we know slavery is kind of one of those big lasting legacies in Africa, and it goes on for over 1,000 years probably when you start putting it all together. Probably for American students, the best known part of this trade is going to be the Atlantic slave trade. And that's going to kick off around the 1500s CE. And this is one of those that maybe you've heard of it referred to as triangular trade, stuff from Europe, those metal tools, cloth, salt, that kind of stuff would be working its way down to the west coast of Africa. Slaves would be sent over to Latin America and the United States and forced to kind of work in agriculture. So that's kind of been very well studied and documented. But I was going to kick off kind of a little bit after the time period that we're studying. But I do want to bring it up now because it's going to be a legacy we still see today, and we're going to see some similarities with the other slave trade. But we're thinking about possibly up to 30 million human beings were sent over that middle passage from Africa to be forced into slavery. The one that's probably less well known, there's less scholarly work into it, and certainly from an American perspective, we don't spend as much time studying, it's got kind of three different names. So you might see it sometimes referred to as the Indian Ocean slave trade because it's going to go across the Indian Ocean, the Arab slave trade because kind of Arab traders are going to, and the Arabian Peninsula will be kind of a center of where a lot of the slaves go and are maybe then sent from, or the Eastern slave trade because they're kind of going, to the east, and particularly from Eastern Africa as well, and then into East Asia. So we'll kind of use those three terms interchangeably. But slaves are going to come out of still that West African area that we go kind of across the trans-Saharan trading route that we saw on our map in the previous slide. They'd also go from places such as kind of Zimbabwe, or it'll later be called Mozambique, there on the eastern coast of Africa, and they'll be sent, sometimes over land, sometimes over water to South Asia, to China, and there's places like Iraq, and so there's actually, Black African descendants and communities still today that can trace their roots back to the slave trade, just like we see there are people in the Americas that can certainly trace their trade back to this era of slavery. This one actually goes on for longer than the Atlantic slave trade, and it starts significantly earlier. We're thinking, 800 CE or so. People are going to start being sent across the trans-Saharan trade route to the Arabian Peninsula. And again, what's being sent back is also going to be things like, salt, clothes, metal tools, those kind of things that, and particularly with the metal tools and later guns and stuff that Africa wasn't able to develop on its own. So there's there's less scholarly research into this, and there's also just less kind of known information, and the numbers just aren't great. So there's a big debate on how many people were maybe sent over this slave trade. There's a lot of people thinking it might have been up around that 30 million number again that we saw with the Atlantic slave trade, probably certainly in at least the 10 to 20 million range. So big group of people, big effect on the history of the world, and certainly on the history of Africa. Now, sometimes we've got to talk about, how people became slaves. Slavery didn't start in Africa when the Arabs or the Europeans showed up. Slavery, like in the rest of the world, had been going on pretty much as long as we know of civilizations kind of being around. Now, most slaves were usually captured prisoners of war. So these smaller clans or tribes would fight wars, capture people, and make them slaves. There could also then in parts of Africa be quote unquote voluntary slavery. It's always, we say it's voluntary, but how much say do people really have in it? They'd mean these people had gone into debt somehow. And again, I always think, okay, did they go into debt because they made a bad financial choice, or did they go into debt because the system was rigged against them? And that's just something, I don't know. There's a lot of debate on that. But they would go in and they were told, well, if you become a slave, you'll be able to work your way out of this debt. Now, of course, that doesn't usually happen. And sometimes even the children of those, we call them debt bonded slaves, would inherit their parents' debt and they would become slaves. So really kind of just a terrible situation that we see going on with the slave trade in Africa. We're going to kind of finish out this topic. We only got a few case studies. We're going to start in West Africa. Our first group is kind of called the Hausa. And this is in what is today kind of northern Nigeria. And I kind of like to think of like as my Hunger Games kingdom, because like I said, Africa is very decentralized. And what's kind of cool about the Hausa, there's like 7 smaller states or kingdoms. Different people use different titles for it. But the different territories or states would specialize in different stuff. So your Western kingdoms kind of specialized in war, and that's kind of where your warriors would come from. You'd have other parts that were kind of like the breadbasket, and that's kind of where they would specialize in agriculture. So kind of just that's kind of a connection I kind of make. Islam's going to eventually kind of come into all of West Africa here, we're going to see, and take over. Ghana is going to become probably one of the more centralized kingdoms. It kind of takes over the Hausa kingdom. And their big role Ghana has is that they're going to be providing gold to these Muslim traders, and they're kind of bringing those things in. Eventually, they're going to kind of get in conflict with their neighbors in Mali, and the Malian Empire is pretty much going to win out. And it's going to replace the Ghanaian Empire. Now, Mali has this just ridiculous amount of gold. Still today, they're mining lots of gold. So they're going to be involved in sending a lot of gold across the trans-Saharan trade route. Probably the best known African king of all time, and probably one of the most fascinating people in world history is a Malian ruler named Mansa Musa, and he's going to become the king of Mali. Now, he became a Muslim. And so one of the 5 pillars of Muslim is the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. So he's got to go across the trans-Saharan trade route to get to Mecca. Well, this dude is loaded. He's a king, and he's going to show everyone how loaded he is. So the statistics are just incredible. It's like thousands of slaves carrying pounds and thousands of pounds of gold. And he pretty much just throws gold out when he gets to these major cities. And he actually throws out so much gold, it devalues the gold that was already there, and it kind of causes kind of a bit of an economic catastrophe and hyperinflation. Not probably what he was going for, probably just trying to be a generous guy. Back in Mali, he does a lot of really cool stuff. He supports education, the arts. And again, certainly not something he was going for, an unintended consequence is when he's on this pilgrimage, his Hajj, people in the Middle East and Europeans kind of see, holy cow, look how rich this guy is. How much gold is in West Africa? We got to get our hands on. So this is going to inspire some of the Europeans pushing in and exploring the western coast of Africa, which is, of course, going to have some terrible consequences for the Europeans. Here's our friend Mansa Musa. And so, you can see how adorned he's in gold and everything. Our other case study is going to be Zimbabwe, which translates to dwellings. So this is on the eastern side of Africa. We also, because in East Africa, we also started talking about our Christians in Ethiopia, and you would still find Christians in Ethiopia like we see here. Now in Zimbabwe, probably the most famous landmark they have is called Great Zimbabwe. And it was this really well-built structure and fortified. I think maybe 20,000 people were living there. So we're talking on par with like Tenochtitlan in the Aztec society. Again, bigger than a lot of your European civilizations. Unfortunately, that was too many people than the land could support. So eventually they have to kind of abandon it because they just don't have enough room. So there's this abandoned, incredibly well-built city. Today it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And when the Europeans show up there, they're very, very racist and thinking there's no way these, inferior black people were able to build this incredible structure. So they start coming up with all these myths saying, well, this is a long lost figure from the Bible. They must have kind of left Israel, some ancient Jewish people came down and they're the ones that built it because there's no way these Africans built it. Now, of course, today we've done the research and we know that the Africans were the ones that built it. So kind of closing out some summary. Big things to remember about Africa. Doing lots and lots of trade. That gold and ivory and people going out, and metal, tools, cloth coming in from both the Middle East and the Indian Ocean trading networks. Really advanced and well-developed civilizations that are wealthy from their gold, but also get involved in scholarly work and literature as well. And then way, way, way more decentralized than what we see going on in the rest of the world at the time. And a lot of religious diversity with the animism, Islam, and Christianity. That'll close it out for today. Make sure we add to our notes and have